Rudolf Hess had been deputy leader of Nazi Germany, only one place behind Adolf Hitler. From 1933 to 1941, Hess, a World War I infantryman and pilot, had been complicit in all the actions taken by the Nazis against its enemy.
He wasn't mad. He was on a mission. In the middle of World War II, Hitler's deputy Rudolf Hess flew solo into Britain.
For Hess, this was really a mission. He felt that this war was totally justified from the German side.
No orders, no backup, just one chilling message and one name, the Duke of Hamilton. What followed wasn't arrest. It was erasure. No trial, no cameras. Just silence, drugs, and a 46-year prison built to keep one man quiet. Why? Because Hess didn't just know secrets. He was one. And someone made sure he would never speak, until now. The flight that should not have happened. May 1941. Britain and Germany were locked in total war. London had just survived devastating air raids, and in the middle of this chaos, one of Hitler's most trusted men did something that made no sense. Rudolf Hess, the deputy leader of Nazi Germany, climbed into a modified fighter plane and flew straight into enemy territory. Alone. No escort, no backup. No permission. One man flying across the North Sea into Britain at the exact moment when hatred for Germany was at its highest. It was so strange that even his closest allies thought he had lost his mind. But what happened next would prove that this was not madness. It was something else. This was not an impulsive act. Rudolf Hess did not wake up one morning and decided to gamble his life. He had been preparing for this for months. By late 1940, he began training in secret. Not at public airfields, but at hidden locations, far from curious eyes. He was not refreshing old skills. He was training for one specific journey. His plane was altered. Extra fuel tanks were installed so he could cross the sea without stopping. A special radio compass was added to guide him through darkness and storms. He studied British coastlines. He memorized routes. He practiced flying by compass alone. Night after night, he rehearsed the same path. He learned where British radar stations were placed. He learned the patrol patterns of Royal Air Force fighters. He even calculated sunset times so he could arrive under cover of darkness. These were not the actions of a man who had lost his mind. These were the actions of a man following a plan. On the evening of May 10, 1941, Hess took off from Augsburg. He flew north over Denmark. Then he turned west. Then he crossed the North Sea. Hess flew through British airspace for hours without being intercepted. British fighters scrambled but never found him in the darkness. Later, questions would arise about whether someone wanted him to reach Scotland. When his fuel finally ran out near Scotland, Hess bailed out. He fell through the night sky and landed on a quiet farm outside Glasgow. He injured his ankle on impact and lay in the dark until a local farmer found him limping through the field. Now imagine that moment. It is nearly midnight. You hear a crash in the distance. Then a man in a flight suit appears from the darkness speaking perfect English. The first words he said were not what anyone expected. He gave a false name. And then he made a very specific request. He said he needed to meet the Duke of Hamilton. After Hess gave a false name, the farmer did not know what to do with him. But word traveled fast. Local authorities were contacted, then military officers, then intelligence. At first, no one believed him. He looked like a tired, injured pilot, nothing more, but he kept repeating the same request. To meet the Duke of Hamilton, not a police officer, not a military commander, a duke. And that was when this story stopped being about war and started being about power. The man he asked for. Within hours, British authorities realized exactly who they had captured. This was not a lost pilot. This was not a defector. This was the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany. Rudolf Hess had just walked into their hands. And yet, something strange happened. There were no press conferences, no photographs, no public celebration. Hess simply vanished. The British government said almost nothing. When Winston Churchill was informed, witnesses later said his reaction was not shock. It was not relief. It was cold. No speeches, no announcements, just one order: secrecy. Hess was quietly transferred into military custody. Then he was moved to an isolated estate called Buchanan Castle, far from the public and far from questions. And then the man Hess had asked for arrived. The Duke of Hamilton. Their first meeting remains one of the most guarded conversations in modern history. No recordings, no transcripts, no official notes. Hamilton later claimed it was brief and meaningless. Few historians believe that, because Hess was not carrying random thoughts. According to British interrogation records later declassified, he claimed he had come with a personal message from Hitler. The offer was simple. Britain would keep its empire. Germany would dominate continental Europe. Together they would contain the Soviet Union. But that was not what terrified Churchill. What terrified him was what Hess said next. Hess claimed that powerful people inside Britain already supported this idea. Men with titles, influence, men who could pressure the government. If that was true, it meant parts of Britain's elite had been communicating with the enemy before the war even began. And this was not impossible. In the 1930s, there was a powerful group in Britain known as the appeasers. They were not radicals. They were not poor. They were wealthy aristocrats, politicians, and members of royal circles. They believed Nazi Germany was not the real threat. They believed communism was. They saw Hitler as a barrier against the Soviet Union, something ugly but useful. Some of them openly admired fascism. Others entertained German diplomats in private homes. They drank together. They spoke about the future of Europe, and Hitler knew this. He counted on it. Then there was the Duke of Windsor, the former King Edward VIII. He had visited Hitler personally. He toured Nazi Germany as Hitler's guest. He was photographed, given the Nazi salute, and British intelligence later considered him a serious security risk. Churchill eventually sent him to the Bahamas to keep him far from European politics. So when Hess claimed he had allies inside Britain's elite, he was not inventing fantasies. He had names, he had connections, he had details, and that is what made him dangerous. Churchill had two options. He could put Hess on trial and risk exposing powerful sympathizers, or he could bury the entire story. He chose burial. The story they sold the world. Churchill did not treat Hess like an ordinary prisoner of war. Instead of a public trial, Hess was handed to British intelligence. His main interrogator was Major Frank Foley, one of the most skilled officers in MI6. Foley was not just an interrogator. Before the war, he had helped thousands of Jews escape Nazi Germany. He understood the Nazi system better than most men alive. For more than a year, Foley questioned Hess. Every statement was recorded. Every claim was cross-checked, and every detail was analyzed. And then, those records vanished from public view. No transcripts were released. No summaries were published. No explanations were given. At the same time, Churchill gathered his closest advisors for a series of secret meetings at Ditchley Park, far from London. There were no notes, no minutes, no official records, only silence. Then the British government introduced a new story. They told the world that Hess was mentally unstable, that he was delusional, that he had flown into enemy territory driven by madness. In other words, nothing he said mattered. This explanation was perfect. If Hess was insane, his claims could be ignored. If he was delusional, his names meant nothing. If he was unstable, his story could be buried. But this story had problems. If Hess was truly mad, why was he not placed in a psychiatric hospital? Why was he kept under armed military guard? Why did MI6 continue interrogating him for intelligence? They were not treating him. They were extracting information. At first, Hess wrote letters that were calm and detailed. He discussed politics. He argued clearly. He remembered events. Then something changed. His writing became confused. He began speaking of invisible enemies. He claimed he was being poisoned. His mental state deteriorated in custody. Whether from isolation, despair, or other factors remains unclear. Was his mind breaking on its own, or was it being pushed? Guards were instructed to limit conversation. News access was restricted. Letters were heavily censored. Every visitor was monitored. His world became smaller and smaller. In 1942, he threw himself over a stair railing. He survived, but he broke his leg. The next year, he tried again. Some historians say this proved he was unstable. Others say it proved something else, that he understood he had been used, that he realized he would never be released, that he knew his role was over. By the mid-1940s, Hess was no longer dangerous because of what he said. He was dangerous because of what he remembered, and that made him perfect for a new role. A man alive, but not free. A man visible, but not heard. A man who could be pointed to, but never believed. And that is when they sent him to a place built not for punishment, but for silence. The prison built for one man. When the war ended, Rudolf Hess was not sent home. He was not transferred to a normal prison. He was not placed among other inmates. He was sent to Spandau prison in West Berlin. Spandau was built to hold hundreds of men. By the mid-1960s, it held exactly one, Rudolf Hess. Think about that. A massive stone fortress, long corridors, rows of empty cells, and one elderly man walking alone through the silence. He lived there for more than 4 decades, not with other prisoners, not with conversation, not with normal human contact, but under constant watch. 40 guards, 24-hour shifts, every movement recorded, every letter censored, every visit approved. 4 nations took turns controlling him: the United States, Britain, France, the Soviet Union. Each country ruled the prison for 1 month, then passed control to the next. No other prisoner in modern history was treated like this. The cost was enormous. Millions were spent every year to maintain a prison designed for hundreds, just to hold one man who posed no physical danger to anyone. So the question becomes impossible to ignore. Why? Other Nazi leaders were released after serving their time. Some returned to quiet lives. Some wrote memoirs, some gave interviews, but Hess was never freed. His official crime was conspiracy and crimes against peace, but he remained imprisoned longer than almost anyone. 3 of the 4 Allied powers eventually supported his release. Only one refused: the Soviet Union. Officially, they said justice demanded it. Unofficially, Spandau gave them something else: a legal presence in West Berlin during the Cold War, and perhaps something more, because the longer Hess lived, the more rumors began to spread. Whether the double theory was true or not, one fact remained. By the 1980s, keeping Hess locked away served no legal purpose and no moral one, yet he was still there, still watched, still silent, still alive, and that was about to become a problem. The man who was not supposed to leave. By the 1980s, the world's attention returned to Spandau. Human rights organizations, journalists, and even some governments began asking why a man in his 90s remained in solitary confinement. Why was a man in his 90s still locked in total isolation? Why was he being watched like a dangerous animal? Why was he being punished long after others had walked free? Human rights groups began to speak out. Doctors called his confinement cruel. Even some former guards said it made no sense. Hess was no longer a threat to anyone. He was old, weak, and could barely walk without help. His son, Wolf, began fighting openly for his release. He wrote letters. He spoke to journalists. He begged governments to let his father die outside those walls. Slowly, pressure began to build. 3 of the 4 Allied powers were now willing to let Hess go. Only one still refused. And then, something strange happened. In the days before his death, Wolf was allowed to visit him. When he arrived, he expected to see a broken man. Instead, he saw someone else. Hess was weak, but he was clear, fragile, but alert. And then he said something that his son, Wolf Rudiger Hess, later reported publicly: "They are going to kill me." 3 days later, Rudolf Hess was dead. The death that refused to make sense. On the morning of August 17, 1987, guards at Spandau prison made a discovery that was supposed to end the story once and for all. Inside a small garden shed, they found Rudolf Hess slumped against the wall. An electrical cord was wrapped around his neck. He was unresponsive. Within hours, the verdict was announced: suicide. Case closed. But almost nothing about that scene made sense. Hess was 93 years old. He was arthritic, nearly blind, and so weak that he needed help getting dressed in the morning. His hands shook constantly. His arms barely lifted above his shoulders. Yet the official story claimed that he had somehow raised his arms high enough to loop an electrical cord over a latch that sat above his reach, secured it, and ended his own life, alone, in a prison under constant surveillance, with 40 guards rotating shifts, with someone always supposed to be watching. No alarms were triggered. No struggle was reported. No one saw anything. Just a body in a shed. Then the physical details began to raise more questions. Bruises were found on his wrists and torso. These were not light marks or the kind of injuries one would expect from an elderly man falling. They looked more like signs of restraint, like the marks of a struggle. That is not what a quiet suicide looks like. Then there was the door. According to some witnesses, it had been locked from the outside. something that should have been impossible if Hess had been alone. Guards later added another troubling detail. Some of them reported seeing unfamiliar personnel near the garden shed shortly before the body was discovered. No one ever explained who those people were, where they came from, or why they were there. And then came what many witnesses later described not as an investigation, but as a cleanup. Items were removed from the scene almost immediately. Medical staff arrived within minutes, but instead of carefully preserving evidence, it felt as if the area was being erased. Hess's son, Wolf, refused to accept the suicide verdict. He demanded an independent autopsy, which was conducted at Munich University. That examination directly contradicted the British report. The pathologist concluded that the injuries were more consistent with strangulation than with self-hanging. But by then, crucial evidence had already vanished. Objects were missing, records were incomplete, photographs were limited, and once again the story was closed. For years, that was where it stayed, surrounded by whispers, doubts, and unanswered questions. No proof, no accountability, until something changed. The files that were never meant to surface. In 2025, an anonymous source uploaded a collection of classified documents to a military historian's archive. The files were heavily encrypted. It took weeks to confirm they were real, but they were. The documents included interrogation transcripts, internal British intelligence memos, and correspondence between MI6 officers, materials that had remained classified for 80 years. And when historians finally opened them, the impact was immediate. These files did not just question how Hess died, they explained why he had been kept alive for so long. According to these documents, Hess's flight to Scotland was not a rogue act. It was a delivery. He had been carrying messages on behalf of secret intermediaries, men who did not want their names on paper and to be seen. British aristocrats had met with Nazi diplomats in neutral Portugal before the war. They discussed peace terms. Not surrender, not defeat. Division. Britain would keep its empire. Germany would control continental Europe. Churchill would be bypassed. The elected government would be ignored. And Hess knew all of it. Names, dates, locations, networks. The documents included coded letters between members of Britain's elite and German officials. Some names were hidden, others were not. What remained was enough to show that these connections reached into Parliament, military intelligence, and circles dangerously close to the monarchy. But the most disturbing document was written much later, an internal memo from MI6 dated 1987, just months before Hess died. The memo indicated that Hess's release was viewed as a threat to political stability, with containment deemed necessary, and then he died. For 46 years, Hess had been kept alive, but silent, not executed, not freed, contained. The truth that was never meant to survive. Rudolf Hess was many things. He was a loyal Nazi, a true believer, and a man who helped shape laws that destroyed millions of lives. He stood beside Hitler during the darkest chapter in human history, defending the ideology, serving it, and helping to carry it out. But he was also something else. He was a witness. He had seen deals that were never written down, promises that were never recorded, and conversations that were never meant to survive history. His flight was not madness. It was a mission. His imprisonment was not just punishment. It was containment. And his death was not simply an ending. It was a solution. For nearly half a century, he was kept alive but silenced, not because he was harmless, but because what he knew was dangerous. Dangerous to reputations, dangerous to institutions, dangerous to the version of history the world had already accepted. The documents that surfaced in 2025 did not merely reveal new facts. They revealed intention. They showed that history had been edited, that powerful people had been protected, and that the public version of events had been carefully shaped. They suggested that aristocrats had whispered with the enemy, that secret contacts had existed, and that silence itself had been negotiated. And they showed that one man carried the memory of all of it. For 46 years, Hess lived behind walls not built to punish him, but to isolate him, not to reform him, but to wait him out. And when the pressure to release him grew too strong, when his age made him sympathetic, when freedom came close enough to matter, the problem returned. Because a free man can speak, and Hess was never supposed to speak. 4 nations guarded him, 40 guards watched him, and yet somehow he died alone in a garden shed. No witnesses, no clarity, no closure, only a story that asked to be believed. So now the question is no longer what happened. The question is who needed it to happen, and why. Make of that what you will. But if this story unsettled you, it should have. Because some secrets do not disappear. They wait, and sometimes they leave behind a body. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.